Well, hey everyone, Chad here coming to you from Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. I'm here for the weekend, for a weekend of ministry in a local church, doing some leaders seminar tomorrow, local church on Sunday, young adults camp for a couple of days, before then heading over to Indonesia. So on a ministry trip, but here to spend our weekend, or my morning at least, with you as week 13 of our Chronological Bible Reading Plan kicks off this week. Our readings are the last half of the book of Joshua, so you should have started Joshua last week, chapters 12 to 24 this week, and then we're also going to start Judges chapter 1 to 7. All right, so last week I spent most of my video, in fact all of my video, just closing off the book of Deuteronomy, okay, because I said I wanted to finish off the Torah, the books of Moses, well. And I didn't say anything about the book of Joshua, even though you should have read the first 11 chapters this week. But this video, I'm going to focus all on Joshua today. So even though we're going to start Judges, I'm just going to focus my attention on Joshua. And I'll give you a summary of the whole book today. All right, so here's the big picture view of the book of Joshua. Basically, it picks up immediately where Deuteronomy finishes off. So Moses dies, Deuteronomy, Joshua's handed over to Joshua, and the book of Joshua starts effectively immediately. They enter the promised land, spend 7 years fighting battles, which they win. Don't want to spoil it for you, but they win after 7 years, and then they disperse into their promised lands. And then at the end of the book of Joshua, about 25 to 30 years after settling down, Joshua calls them all together to him again as a nation, and he gives them his final departing words, and he dies at the age of 110. So that's sort of the big picture view. Later on, I'll split it up into 3 sections for you to help you see, again, the big picture of this book. Jewish tradition calls the book of Joshua through to Kings, so Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and Samuel, the former prophets. All right, so we've read the Torah from Moses, and now we're reading the former prophets. And there's a lot of prophetic voices. I mean, Moses obviously was a prophetic voice in his own right, but that's the Torah. We've got voices like Deborah and Elisha and Elijah, okay, and Joshua himself and Nathan the prophet. There's key prophetic voices in these books, but they're called the former prophets. They are essentially narrative books still. It's still a storyline that you're following. They're not prophetic books like we get to when you get to Isaiah and Jeremiah and all those guys on the other side of the Psalms, okay? We haven't got there yet. These former prophets are basically historical books that join Moses' death through to the establishment of Israel as a kingdom under, Saul and David, all right? So here's where we're at in the big picture. We've read about the age of the ancients, Abraham, Enoch, okay, Noah, those guys, up to Abraham, the age of the ancients. Then we read about the age of the patriarchs, Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, to the end of Genesis. Then began the age of the judges, Moses being the first one, Joshua being his national successor, and then, as we'll see in the next book in Judges, a whole bunch of other judges who rise up to lead God's people at various times, which takes us through to the era of the kingdom. So there's the big picture view where we go from the age of the ancients through to the age of the kings, and this period, the age of the judges, is linking those two. All right, so you should enjoy the book of Joshua. It's very easy reading. It's quite quick, especially in the first opening chapters. There's a lot of momentum happening as God's people are moving forward, and it's pretty well an easy read. Okay, so here you go. 3 main sections of the book of Joshua that I see that I think you should pay attention to. The first is the chapters you should have read last week, chapters 1 through to 12, which I simply call Joshua's Victories. All right, it is 7 years of battles as they go into the promised land. And it starts by God saying to Joshua, listen, as I was with Moses, so I'm going to be with you. As I was with Moses, so I'm going to be with you. And so it's kind of no surprise that Joshua's first miracle, first big significant sign that he is God's chosen one, all right, is that he parts his own Red Sea. All right, Moses parts the Red Sea for God's people to come into. Joshua does the same thing. He parts the River Jordan. A few slight variations of the story, but it's a similar vibe. He parts the River Jordan for God's people to go into the promised land. So it starts off great. We've got the stories of Jericho, the trumpets, Rahab, the city Ai, and Achan who steals the gold. Okay, you read about all those last week. But after that, it is just victory after victory, city after city, month after month, year after year for 7 years. Incredibly successful successful military campaigns with great momentum under the leadership of Joshua. And all this time, remember, the people that they are casting out and defeating are the Canaanites. Now you go right back to the book of Genesis, okay? And Canaan was the son that exposed Noah's nakedness when he was drunk, all right? And he exposed his father's nakedness. Noah woke up and Noah cursed his son Canaan. And that curse effectively is coming upon them as Joshua is defeating the descendants of Canaan in what is meant to be their promised land. So after 7 years, they basically break the back of their enemy. They don't defeat all the enemies in the promised land because it's a big patch of land, but they win significant cities and significant regions. And Joshua basically calls it after 7 years and says, guys, that's enough. As far as a national army fighting together, we're done. We can now split up and settle down in your patch of earth, okay? And then each region will be responsible for continuing to drive out the enemies in those areas. So in that 7 years, we see a national campaign of Joshua's victories, which are all summarized in chapter 12 by listing 33 kings that were defeated over that time. So chapter 12 is a really nice break there in the story. The second part of the book of Joshua is where they divide up the promised land. All right, so a whole from chapter 13 to 22 is to 10 chapters is devoted just to divvying up the promised land. Now remember, Israel, strictly speaking, is 13 tribes. The Levites don't get their own unique patch of land because they're going to be scattered among all the others, okay? So there's 12 patches of land. However, 2.5 tribes stayed across the river. So what Joshua has to do is divide up 9.5 tribes worth in this side of the river on the promised land. The first cabs off the rank, the first ones are Judah and Joseph, the half tribe here, Judah and Joseph. Judah was chosen first because of Caleb. Remember, it was Joshua and Caleb who said, we can take on the giants, we can do it. Caleb is still there, 80 years of age, okay? He is still there, and he said, I'm going to be first cab off the rank. I'm going to get the land Moses promised me. So the land of Judah, where Caleb is from, is first, and then Joseph was first picked because, after all, remember, he was Israel's favorite son. And the biggest blessings, of course, if you read through Israel's prophecies in Genesis 49, were given to those two sons. So it's no coincidence, okay, that they had the first pick of the promised land because after all, way back in Genesis 49, Israel promised the biggest blessing to them in his dying years. So this leaves 7 tribes left to divvy up the land. And what they do there is they cast lots to do that at the tabernacle, which they put in Shiloh. The first tribe to come up, of course, is Benjamin. Why would God choose Benjamin first? Because he was Israel's second favorite son after Joseph, okay? His favorite sons were born to Rachel. Benjamin was born to Rachel. So when they cast lots, of course, Benjamin gets picked first. In that, it's God's way of saying he's Israel's favorite son, and I'm honoring that. The other thing that's interesting is that Levi gets the smallest patch of land. And one of the things I want to encourage you to do is do what I do in my study Bible here. I've got a picture of the promised land that's color coordinated, how they divided up the land. It's quite a useful thing to have in front of you. And one of the interesting things is that Simeon, his land is swallowed up inside of Judah. So he's kind of the brother, right, that gets the hand-me-down land from Judah. Basically, Judah says, oh, we've got too much. How about Simeon has what we can't, what's too much for us? He gets the hand-me-down. And again, no surprise, okay, because right back in Genesis 49, when Israel's prophesying over his sons, Simeon gets the smallest blessing prophesied. And you can read about that because it's all about Israel's prophecy being fulfilled. So all of this ties in. This is why we read the Bible chronologically, all right? Because you see all of this tying in as history goes. And then, of course, they divvy up all the lands, and the Levites, remember, get dispersed among the lands. Now, don't think that means they don't own property, okay? Don't think the Levites, priests, were therefore not property owners. They were therefore destined to be poor the rest of their life. No. To say they didn't have an inheritance of land simply means that they didn't have a big region that was their own state, if you like. You know, in the United States or the Federation of Israel, however you like to put it, they did not have their own state to look after, their own territory to look after. They were dispersed among the tribes, but they were still landowners. They still owned houses. They still owned farms. They were still looked after and financially prosperous wherever they were dispersed and wherever they lived. So finally, all that's dispersed, and of course Reuben and Gad, or the 2.5 tribes that wanted the land on the other side of the Jordan, their fighting men go back to their wives and children after 7 years, and they say, we're back, we helped out our brothers, and now it's time to settle. So that's basically the story of Joshua until we get to the third section, which is the final 2 chapters. And this is where I'm going to finish, obviously. The final 2 chapters of Joshua, which is Joshua's final words. The first section, Joshua's victories. The second section, Joshua divides up the land. The third section, the last 2 chapters, are Joshua's departing words, which is some 25 to 30 years later. So there's this big gap there of about 25 to 30 years. Joshua basically calls all God's people together and he says, listen, just as God was faithful with his blessings, so also God will be faithful to his promised curses if you disobey him. I mean, my goodness, this is just like Moses, okay? It's like the last depressing word before he dies. He tells God's people, yes, God's blessed us because we've obeyed, but listen, you better not disobey because God will be faithful to his curses. And he does this by gathering his people at Shechem. Now, that's where the tabernacle is built, but it's significant because it's also where the Mount Ebal is. And Mount Ebal was the place when they first came into the promised land and they prophesied blessings and curses to one another. That was the place where they prophesied curses, all right? So there they are standing before the mountain where 40 years earlier, 40-something years earlier, they prophesied curses. Now Joshua is saying to them, you listen to me. God will curse you if you disobey him. So just as Joshua begins his ministry like Moses, parting the sea, so also he finishes his ministry like Moses did by reminding God's people of the curses that will come upon them if they disobey him. Just like Moses, Joshua summarizes their history. Just like Moses, he stresses the covenant curses that will come upon them if they disobey the law. Just like Moses, he writes down the words of the covenant law in the book of the law. He writes it again. And just like Moses, he makes a monument that will be a sign or a witness against them of the curses that will come against them. Now, Moses did it in a song. Joshua doesn't sing a song for us. He leaves us with a memorial stone. He puts a stone there to say, this stone will serve as a witness against you. But unlike Moses, Joshua does something a little different. Unlike Moses, Joshua at the end of his ministry does not appoint a successor. Okay? Instead, what he does, he doesn't say, just like Moses appointed me, so I'm going to appoint this guy to be the national leader of the Federation of Israel, the United States of Israel. He doesn't do that. There is no national leader. He doesn't say, all he says is this. He says, as for me and my house, I'm going to serve the Lord. And so as for you and your house, you go and do the same, basically. He said he left every tribe up to their own jurisdiction, and each tribe and therefore each clan and therefore each family was responsible for serving God without a national governance. Now, they still had a national law, they still had a shared law, they still had a shared history, but they didn't have a federal government, all right, to impose that law upon them. They were to take responsibility as autonomous regions, autonomous clans, okay, to obey God's law. And that is what leads us into the book of Judges. Because that model of leadership where, hey, God's been good to us. Remember how good he is. Don't disobey him or he'll curse you. It's up to you now to live like this without a Moses, without a Joshua leading you. That model, which sounds pretty good, they should have been okay with it, didn't work that well for them. Because as Israel's history shows, they have a proclivity. The law stirs up sin. And so they have a proclivity within them to deviate from God's law over and over again. And so we hit on into the book of Judges, which is the story of God's people disobeying until a judge raises up. Disobeying until a judge raises up. But I don't want to give too much away. I hope you enjoy the book of Joshua. Head on into the book of Judges. It's a really key book. Joshua is a really key figure. And enjoy the book this week. Enjoy the victories and enjoy your time. I'm going to enjoy Malaysia. I've got to go now and have dinner. It's been a long day. All right, bless you guys and have a great reading this week. See you.